Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Brien again, and welcome to the video quiz for Key Concept 2.2. And again, this focuses on period 2, 1607 to 1754. And I promise you I will try to make this one a lot quicker than the previous one. That one kind of got away from it, so I apologize for that one. And also, please remember that these video quizzes are meant to be kind of an overview of, and a specific focus on the key concepts. Some of the things that will be introduced in these videos, especially in one like this, will be covered in greater detail either in class or in a subsequent video. So let's get started. Alright, so Key Concept 2.2, European colonization efforts in North America stimulated intercultural contact and intensified conflict between the various groups of colonizers and native peoples. That's another way of saying that basically a bunch of cultures came into contact with each other, whether it was the Big Four, France, the Dutch, English, and the Spanish with each other, or whether it was each of those with the Indians, with the natives. And there was intercultural conflict. Also, I forget if I said conflict or contact. There was both, conflict and contact, but in the reverse order. Contact first, then conflict. Pretty hard the other way around. Alright, some of the essential questions. How and why did Europeans begin to compete with each other in North America, the Big Four? And how did the conflicts lead to social and political changes between Europeans and natives? Alright, this is Key Concept 2.2, Roman numeral 1, from the College Board. Competition over resources between European rivals, the Big Four, led to conflict within and between North American colonial possessions and American Indians. Conflicts among Europeans spread to North America and affected natives. It's kind of a way of saying these Big Four, not so much the Dutch, they were kind of like the rich bankers of Europe, but all the other of the Big Four, the three remaining, they were in conflict with each other, and those conflicts boiled over into the New World. Alright? And who got the brunt of it? The natives. So, first off, you have French and English conflicts that also became the French and the English competing for the loyalty of the natives. You have Fort Necessity, which you see pictured right here. The English and the French competing over that. And George Washington, by the way, starts that conflict. He loses badly, and that eventually becomes the French and Indian War, or what's also known as the 7 Years' War, from 1754 to 1763. And both sides had things to offer the Indians. The British were able to offer more goods. They were richer. Whereas the French were nicer, basically. They were more tolerant of the natives, intermarried with the natives. The French were there to make money, to trade fur. They were not there to settle, so to speak, not there to take over the land. So it was a softer relationship. Remember, the English had the most harsh relationship among the Big Four with the natives. So during the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War, almost all the natives were allied with the French, except for the Iroquois. They fought with the British. So again, don't be fooled by the name the French and Indian War. It was the French and the Indians against the British. So that's a big example of conflict between two of the Big Four, the French and Indian War, and how the interplay between that and the Indians. Most fought with the French, the Iroquois fought with the British. We competed for their alliances. Alright, continued. Each European nation sought to acquire valuables and new labor in the New World. The English focused on tobacco, while we've already learned the Spanish, the Spanish focused on first mining for gold and precious metals, then agriculture. You know that the English and the Spanish used slaves in the encomienda system, but the English used indentured servants at first, mostly indentured servants, some slaves, and then after Bacon's Rebellion, remember, that kind of switched to where slaves became the most common source of labor. The French focused on trading in the Ohio Valley. That should say valley there. That word should be valley, in the Ohio Valley. I said it 3 times, so you should be able to figure out that should be valley by now. And they traded with the natives. So European and colonial interests often varied, meaning the colonies often disagreed with what their European mother countries wanted back in Europe. The biggest example would be the British colonies. All right, after the 7 Years' War, colonists wanted to expand further west. Britain said, we don't want that. Remember, Britain's goal here was to make money. So, there was this big rebellion out in Detroit, this big conflict between English settlers and natives. It was called Pontiac's Rebellion, hence the name of the car. And Britain said to itself, I don't want all this conflict with natives. I want to make money. So they tried to forbade the white settlers from moving west, which was a big no-no in the minds of the white settlers. All right, and if you look right here, the Proclamation line of 1763, this is the line whereby Britain said, "You guys, you can't go past this line. Once you get here, you got to stop." And the settlers basically didn't want to stop. And by the way, just so you know, the French were kind of out here. So Britain passed acts, and again, this starts the whole conflict that eventually leads to the Revolutionary War. And again, we will go into this in much more detail, but this is just an extreme overview of it. Britain passes an act to raise money. Remember, they were in debt after the 7 Years' War. They paid for the war to protect us. They had to keep soldiers in the New World to protect us from the Indians. And that cost money. It ain't free. So they began to try and make money off of taxing us. And that also we didn't like. So Britain passed acts to raise money. The first one being the Molasses Act. We call that the Sugar Act. Molasses was the sugar. And we got around that by smuggling. I mean, John Hancock was a huge smuggler. Huge. Not just his signature. All right. Not just his signature was huge. That's the joke, is the biggest signature on the Constitution. On the Declaration, I'm sorry. This would become a major point of contention between 1763 and 1776, when that thing called the Revolutionary War began. So the French and Indian War, aka 7 Years' War, kind of set that off. We'll go into much more detail about that. All right, Roman numeral 2 for Key Concept 2.2. Clashes between European and American Indian social and economic values caused change in both cultures. So, contact with Europeans increased trade, increased diseases, and drastically changed native life. As time passed, Europeans increasingly encroached on native land. When settlers first got here, European settlers, they were in pretty dire straits. They didn't really know how to survive. The Indians helped them survive. They were kind of okay with the European settlers being there. They even used them to try and gain more power than the other native tribes. And they also didn't see them as much of a threat because they were so weak. So when the European settlers first got there, they needed the help of the Indians, and they got it. The Indians were not threatened by the European settlers. But here's the thing. Once the Indians realized the European settlers were going to keep on spreading, that's when conflict began. So as time passed, Europeans increasingly encroached on native land, and that's when the tension began. So, for example, in 1600, there was 100,000 natives in New England, and there was only 10,000 by 1675, by disease, dispersion, and violent conflict. The largest scale example of violent conflict between English settlers and Indians would be King Philip's War. There were others which we will learn about, but the last, in New England at least, and the most famous that we can talk about is King Philip's War. It was a war between the natives, mostly Wampanoags, and the English in New England in 1675 and 1676. The English called him King Philip. Everybody else that was non-English, the other Indians, called him Metacomb. All right. And it was the Indians' last attempt to try and stop the white encroachment on their land, and they lost. So, the natives in New England were rarely a threat after the war. Now remember, European settlers felt it was justified for them to take the land. They felt that Indians had no claim to the land because they did not, in their view, improve it. All right, in other words, there was no what we would call progress. There was no improvement, change that improved. The Indians didn't really change how they lived. Their way of life was sustainable. It would last forever, but it did not progress the way the Europeans thought that you should progress when you live on land. You should improve it. All right. Now, it's a little bit of a myth that Indians didn't have a sense of ownership over the land. Here's the thing. They, on one hand, didn't feel that you could own the earth. They felt it was kind of like a communal thing for everybody to take advantage of. So they felt the tribe of Indians could have sole access to a piece of land, but they didn't feel an individual could own the land. So they did have an idea of what it meant to own the land. It was just different from the European sense of ownership. So it's a little bit of a myth where you have these kind of smart white Europeans going up to these savage Indians who have just no idea what it means to own land. It isn't that simple. Remember that for the quiz. Alright. So, to continue, Roman numeral 2. Spanish colonization, as you already know, tended to be more accommodating after the Pueblo Revolt than the English. Spain allowed more freedoms for Pueblos after the revolt. They also did tend to see natives as savages or heathens, but it was softer than the English views of the natives, and they did allow intermarriage. Remember that only the English didn't really allow it. Some Puritans, New England white settlers, European settlers, sought to convert the natives, but many viewed them as disposable. You would sometimes say what were called captivity narratives. Before the Europeans got here, most Indian warfare wasn't excessively violent and destructive. It was ceremonial, and if you lost, the losing warriors went and lived with the other tribe many times. All right, so and a lot of times the actual battle was you going to kidnap the other tribe's warriors. And when a white settler was kidnapped, a woman, for example, she would keep a diary of the savages that were keeping her captive, and it was eventually published, known as captivity narratives. But you also have the opposite. We have examples of white settlers running away to Indian settlements and having to be brought back, kicking and screaming. This was early on to the European settlements. All right. And as I kind of intimated here, American Indian warfare became more dangerous after European contact. They began to fight more like Europeans after this. In other words, the idea became to destroy your opponent, destroy them, their entire village. And that was more of a European style of warfare. They traded for guns and other advanced weapons. Remember, horses were introduced by the Europeans. Okay, King Philip's War was one of the bloodiest early native wars. Alright, now that we're done with the content, let's quickly wrap up with some test tips. Alright, so on the multiple choice and the short answer question sections of the AP test, you should be familiar with the effect of European contact on natives, specifically the loss of their land, the high death rates, whether it was disease or increased fighting due to the new weapons or fighting with the European settlers. For the essay questions, be able to compare the colonization tendencies of each of the big four, the Spanish, the French, and the English. I know the Dutch we haven't talked about really at all. Basically, all you've got to know is that it was New York City, it becomes New York City, the English eventually take over, and the Dutch were there to make money. They didn't really care about much else. They were there to make money. So New York City from the get-go, and it used to be called New Amsterdam, New Netherland, from the get-go. Anybody can go there, any religion, any ethnicity, and as long as you can make a buck, you were there. So that's the start of the Big Apple, basically. And also be able to compare their views and treatments of the natives. Alright, so hopefully you filled out the fill-in note sheet, and be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.